Ruth chapter 2, starting at verse 1 on page 268. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Ruth chapter 3, starting at verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, and with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today."
Here's the question to begin with. Is God working for us? Is God working for us? My guess is that most of all us will know the Bible's answer to that question. We've been thinking about that sort of thing all evening, God's generosity to us. We know that he is, but we don't always know that he is. That's what a student said to me this time last week, in fact. I know that he's for me. I know that he's for me, but I don't always know that he's for me. I know that he's for me, but I don't always know that he's for me. That's so often the case, isn't it? I know that he's for me, but not always know in my heart, especially when it's hard to identify the tangible ways that he's working for us. It would be fine if we were back in some of the Bible times, maybe the time of the Exodus, when the ways that God is for us are so big and bold and mighty. When Moses and Pharaoh are battling it out in the corridors of power, or when the Red Sea parts, or Mount Sinai wrapped in smoke. Faced with that, you'd know that God was for you. But we don't have any of that. I'm guessing none of us became a Christian at the same time that the Red Seas were parted and we walked through. And when we're lacking those big, dramatic signs, well, we know that God is for us, but maybe we struggle to know it. That was potentially the question for the first readers of this book of Ruth. I suggested last week this book that we're studying, though describing events around 1100 BC, was recorded in this form about 500 years later for those returning to the land after a period in exile. You can ask me later, and I can try and explain to you why I think that's the case. But it's worth seeing that those returning from exile had the same big question as us. Is God working for us? Their big return to the land was nothing like those events in the Exodus. No big dramatic signs, no water parting, no pillars of smoke. It was easy for them to doubt that God was working for them. And it was certainly the question with which we left Naomi at the end of Ruth chapter 1. She had returned to the Lord, returned to the land. It was, as we said, a turn to hope. But after the tragic events of last week, she had doubts that God was working for her. Of course she did. She'd been widowed, and her daughter-in-law Ruth had been widowed too. As 1 verse 21 put it, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. It didn't look like God was working for her. And yet, as we work through the rest of this book, we're going to see God's providence at work. That is his divine care and provision. In his providence, in his divine care, God was working for her. And the aim for us as readers is that as we see God's providence at work for her, we might come to understand God's providence at work for us. Two things tonight for us to see in particular. The first, there on the handout, God's providence is abundantly generous. God's providence is abundantly generous. Look with me at Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Now you might remember that we left Naomi and Ruth at the end of last week, arriving in Bethlehem, destitute at the beginning of barley harvest. They wouldn't have much hope really of enjoying the riches of that barley, but God had provided for such people in the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 24, printed on the handout there, says, when you reap your harvest in your fields and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. That is, rather than hoovering up every last bit of grain when they're doing the harvesting, if harvesters dropped a bit, then they had to leave it behind, so that those who were poor could kind of grab a few little bits at the end and try and get enough grain to last through the day. And Ruth, as a foreigner in the land, she heads out to benefit from that provision. But notice how from the very opening verses, the narrator places God as the main actor in this account. We get this random detail in verse 1. Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. But it's not actually until verse 3 that we discover why that's relevant. So Ruth set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Happened to. She just happened to. As one translator puts it, her chance chanced upon. She happened to land in the field of Boaz. And for Ruth, it was just luck, a total accident. But as someone has rightly put it, within human luck is divine intentionality. This is the Lord's hand at work. Throughout the abundant generosity of this chapter, we need to see that God is the one who is behind it. Ruth just hoped to find some bloke in whom she would find favor. But in God's providence, she experienced abundant favor. Consider the way that favor comes across when Boaz arrives. He knows that he's obliged to let Ruth glean, but see how he goes above and beyond. Verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? We were told last week that all of this was happening in the days of the judges, the days when the judges ruled. That is a time of real wickedness and lawlessness in the land of Israel. You can read the book of Judges later, and you'll see how dangerous it was. As Naomi puts it at the end of the chapter, there was a real risk of Ruth being assaulted when she went out to a random field. But God had her land in Boaz's field, and Boaz commits himself to her protection. In fact, he does more than that. Look at the end of verse 9. He said to her, "When you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Now, there was no provision in the law about providing refreshments for those who were gleaning, but it's as though Boaz offers her a key to the staff break room. Whenever you're getting thirsty, Ruth, just pop in there and grab a Diet Coke from the staff fridge. Can you imagine someone being so generous to someone who's hoovering up all the bits that you drop? It's all the more remarkable when you remember that Ruth wasn't from around there. Time and time again in this chapter, she's described as Ruth the Moabite. She's a foreigner. Indeed, she points that out. Verse 10, "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to Boaz, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?' To which Boaz responds, 'All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.'" We saw last week when Ruth turned to the Lord, and it's described in this wonderful way in verse 12 as coming to take refuge under the Lord's wings, like a chick nestling under the wing of her mother hen's wings, nestling under the wing of the chicken, the hen, for protection. That's what Ruth has done in dependence on the true God of the Bible. And Boaz helps us to see his favor as the Lord's generous response. The Lord, verse 12, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord." Boaz continues to shower favor over her at lunchtime, verse 14, "And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And then it gets even better when she heads into the afternoon. Verse 15, when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and don't rebuke her.'" Do you see what he's saying? She's already allowed to kind of pick up bits that drop in the field, but Boaz lets her behind the scenes, as though when they're loading up the lorries, she's allowed to climb onto the lorry and check whether anything dropped off a crate. In fact, he says to his workers, "Make sure you drop some stuff off the crate. In fact, just knock some stuff off so that she's got extra bits that she can pick up." If we're in any doubt about the abundant generosity here, then picture this scene when she gets home to Naomi. "How did you fare, my daughter? Did you manage to get enough," says Naomi, for us to eat tonight?" Well, says Ruth, "I did. I got this, and this, and this, and this. An ephah of barley, which has been clogging up my floor space in the pulpit till now. 22 litres of grain." That is not normal pickings, is it? From gleaning. And when Naomi hears that it wasn't just some random field, but the field of her relative Boaz, well, she recognizes the hand of the Lord in it all. Verse 20, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Boaz has been generous, and we should see the Lord's hand at work. Ruth took Boaz's grain home, and it came from an abundantly generous God. And the point is clear, isn't it? God is not stingy. I'm stingy. My friends and family know this. Growing up with 3 brothers, I should have learned how to share, but instead I learned how to make sure I got my rights. And if someone else got given something, I tell you, I was going to make sure I got given the same amount. And I have had to fight my whole adult life, that kind of penny pinching spirit. But it's so easy to think that God is that kind of penny pinching, ungenerous individual. Maybe you're someone who wouldn't call yourself a Christian, and you've concluded that the God Christians worship is a miserly figure in the sky, whose only gifts to humanity are a bunch of rules. You shalt and you shalt not. Even those of us who are Christians can be in danger of thinking something similar, deeply conscious of all that we have given up for God, but struggling to think of the things that we have been given by him. How easy to cast God as some sort of divine Scrooge, only paying out what he has to. No, if you want to know what God is really like, well, look at Boaz in Ruth chapter 2. Protection, refreshment, overflowing provision. This is the generosity of the Lord. God is not stingy. But what does that actually look like in day-to-day life? What does it look like in the long term? It's wonderful for Ruth and Naomi during barley harvest, but the chapter finishes with the harvest time coming to an end. What's the long-term solution? Which takes us to our second point. On the handout, I've put God's providence is according to his design, or even better, God's providence works through human means. God's providence works through human means. As we head into chapter 3, we're reminded that Ruth and Naomi still have a problem. As I mentioned last week, women didn't have access to jobs in their culture, so being widowed left them extremely vulnerable. God's answer to that problem in Deuteronomy 25 was the principle of levirate marriage. That is, if a husband died before having a son, his brother should marry his widow in order to provide an heir. It seems to have been tied up with a broader principle in Leviticus 25, where those who are struggling in other ways would be rescued by their closest living relative, a redeemer. That's why Boaz is described frequently in this book as a redeemer, a relative who by marrying into the family could provide where the women were destitute. And it's why Naomi is so excited at the end of chapter 2 when she discovered that God had guided Ruth into Boaz's field. Boaz has the potential not just to provide grain for a few weeks, but to offer a marriage that would provide for them all long term. Now, this law about levirate marriage doesn't apply to us anymore. My sisters-in-law can all breathe a sigh of relief. But for those like Naomi and Ruth, it was a lifeline, a very normal human means to care for people in their vulnerability. And it's a lifeline that Naomi hatches a plan to claim in chapter 3, verse 1. The chapter follows a very similar pattern to chapter 2. Ruth and Naomi have a conversation. Ruth goes out, she interacts with Boaz and gets some generosity from him, and then she comes back for a debrief with Naomi. They're very similarly structured, but while chapter 2 kind of focused on this happy accident, chapter 3 puts loads more emphasis on human agency. For example, verse 1, then Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do." Do you see how Ruth is taking initiative to try and make this happen, where they benefit from this redeemer figure? In fact, Ruth, I think, similarly shows some initiative. She heads down to the threshing floor. She does what Naomi said. But when Boaz wakes up and finds her at his feet, and he's pretty startled by the event, as I imagine you would be, she doesn't just wait to be told by Boaz what to do. Rather, verse 9, he said to her, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." You see, Ruth, like Naomi, she steps up in order to claim this lifeline that the Lord provided. And it earns Boaz's commendation. Verse 10, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." For a long time, I wasn't that convinced that this chapter was about human initiative. I was a bit fearful that it took too much attention off of God, until someone pointed out how the author works so hard to underline what the humans are doing. In fact, did you notice the key terms which are applied to the Lord earlier in the book, but which get applied to human characters in chapter 3? I've tried to reflect them on that table on the right-hand side of the handouts. Back in chapter 1, rest came from the Lord. But in 3 verse 1, Naomi says, should I not seek rest for you? In chapter 2, Ruth came to take refuge under the Lord's wings. But in 3 verse 9, she takes refuge under the wings of Boaz. Again, in chapter 2, we saw the Lord's kindness at work. But here, it's Ruth who is credited with kindness. And throughout this chapter, the author underlines the activity of human agents, the people advancing the plot. God's provision is abundantly generous, and it's worked out using human means. Those of us who understand a little bit of God's providence can slip into an attitude of let go and let God. God will provide, so I don't need to do anything. I'm just going to sit here and put my feet up. But a mature understanding of God's providence means that we know he uses human means, like Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. His providence is worked out while humans step up and take action and do things. Not that any of this is suggesting that we go off and do things our own way, as though God has washed his hands of us and is only pretending to provide. No, it's still working out according to his design. For a start, we're reminded of God's sovereign control with a hiccup in the timing in verse 12. Boaz is in the middle of his response to Ruth when he says, verse 12, now it's true that I'm a redeemer, yet there is another redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he'll redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he's not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I'll redeem you. Lie down until the morning. That's not what we were expecting when we read all of this going on. Suddenly the timing is all off. Naomi's plan didn't account for this. Sometimes we find that God is planning something different from us. Our human plans have to give way to God's plan being worked out. His timing is the timing we follow. Even while God's providence works through human means, it is ultimately always according to his design. But even more significantly, I think there's a thread running through this chapter about everything being done according to God's law. Lots of people have talked about the striking sexual undertones of the chapter. It happens at the dead of night. Ruth makes all these preparations. Uncovering his feet, I'm told, is a euphemism for uncovering his genitals. It's no wonder that he was startled when he woke up in the middle of the night, is it? The details seem even to be alluding to this great sexual immorality that started off the nation of Moab, which you can read about in Genesis 19. And we might read this chapter and think that it justifies us going off and doing things our own way. God's providence works out through human means, so I'm going to work things out my own way. God doesn't seem to be drawing people into his kingdom. Well, it's supposed to be human means. I'll do it my own way. I'll change the gospel and do whatever it is that I can drag people in by. Or God doesn't seem to be providing me with a Christian spouse. Well, in that case, I'll take things into my own hands and I'll marry a non-Christian instead. After all, Ruth and Boaz didn't care that much about God's design for these things, did they? But the point is they did. Whatever sexual atmosphere might be going on in Ruth chapter 3 seems to be there to show up how chaste and lawful they both were. Ruth is not the adulteress that we might expect of a Moabite. No, Boaz tells us that the whole town knew Ruth as a worthy woman. Boaz himself refuses to take things forward until he's sure that everything's been done right. And he makes sure that Ruth goes home when it's safe to do so, when there's no risk that she might be accused of doing something untoward. Even Naomi's plan at the beginning, it's not her going off and doing things her own way. She's wanting to claim God's provision of a kinsman redeemer, as God made clear in the law of Moses. God's providence, it's abundantly generous, and it's worked out using human means according to his design. And I wonder, can you see what that means for our opening question? Is God working for us? When there's no mighty acts of judgment, no parting of the Red Sea, no mountains wrapped in smoke, is God still working for us? Well, Ruth encourages us to answer that question, yes. And he's not stingy about it. But don't expect it to look spectacular. I was talking about this book with one of the associates a few weeks ago who confusingly happens to be called Ruth, but it should have alerted me to the fact she had something helpful to say about the book of Ruth, and she did. she shared this really helpful lesson. We should stop expecting our lives to look like the Red Sea and start to expect them to look like the ordinary. That's right, isn't it? Don't expect God's providence to look like dramatic miracles, manna from heaven, 10 plagues, a smoking mountain. God's providence is abundantly generous, and it works out through normal human means. Not necessarily working through those like Moses and Pharaoh in the corridors of power, but here, an ordinary man and an ordinary woman. And not about walking through the parting of the Red Sea, but someone happening to find herself in the right place. And not ascending a mountain to the presence of the Lord, but an unremarkable couple lying in Bethlehem's straw. It's not impressive, but there we find God at work in the hidden details through human means to establish his kingdom. As you invite friends and colleagues to this series of events later on this month, it won't look remarkable. I'm guessing there won't be manna from heaven. Certainly no plagues, we trust. But God will be at work, providing generously, working through human means to establish his kingdom. As you press on in serving others with the gospel, encouraging Christians to keep going with Jesus, having those hard conversations with brothers and sisters, praying steadily, you might not see movements in the corridors of power, but you might see movement in the corridors of your office. And God will be at work, providing generously, working through human means to establish his kingdom. And I'm deliberately applying in the realm of advancing God's kingdom, because this is ultimately about his kingdom. God's provision in these chapters. It looked like grain and a husband, but this book isn't about finding your Boaz. Let me tell you, if you really want to wind me up, tell me how helpful you find this as a book for finding your spouse. Ugh, awful. No, this is ultimately about God providing a redeemer. God's providence is abundantly generous, and it works out through human means, according to his design and his particular means. His particular design is through his particular Redeemer. In fact, the whole Old Testament is filled with God's promise that he would provide a Redeemer in the line of David. And as we'll see next week, these events were all about the family of David. Boaz and Ruth, it turns out, were David's great-grandparents. So this book isn't ultimately about food or spouses, but about God's generous provision of his Redeemer. As we watch how God worked in the lives of Boaz and Ruth and Naomi, we're reminded that God has always been sovereignly at work to provide his king. As one commentator put it very helpfully, the book of Ruth shows that the workings of divine providence on behalf of David began during the lives of his ancestors. And what happened to Naomi and Ruth can be understood as giving hope for the future of the Davidic house. Just as King David was born a few generations after the events of this book, so God's people, generations later, were being assured that God was still at work in the hidden details, even through unimpressive human means, to provide his great Redeemer. And not through those like Moses and Pharaoh in the corridors of power, but another ordinary woman and another ordinary man. Not walking through the parting of the Red Sea, but that couple happening to find themselves in the right place. Not ascending a mountain to the presence of the Lord, but an unremarkable baby lying in Bethlehem's straw. When we know that God is for us, but we don't know that he is for us, well, we need to stop looking for some event like the Red Sea and start to expect God's provision to look more like the ordinary. Because it turns out that God's ordinary provision is actually far more generous and far more significant than anything that had come before. But to see that, we're going to need to look at Ruth chapter 4, which we'll do next week. Let me lead us in a prayer as we close. We thank you, our loving Heavenly Father, that you are so abundantly generous. We praise you for all the ways that you are working, even in those hidden details. And most of all, we praise you for what you have done for us and all that you are doing for us in and through the Lord Jesus. Help us, we pray, to trust your providence, looking to him. And we ask it in his name. Amen.